Good evening, one and all. It's my pleasure to join you this evening as you celebrate the 40th anniversary of Boyle McCauley News. I think this is a perfect opportunity to celebrate the achievements over the last 4 decades, to look back at your accomplishments and celebrate this remarkable milestone. But it's also a great opportunity to look ahead to the next 40 years. And my talk is going to focus around the reason why you need to continue for another 40 years. Now, in today's digital era, in the social media sphere, one could ask the question, why do you even need community newspapers in the first place? What's the value of having a community newspaper when a Facebook post or a tweet can go viral in a matter of seconds? For those of you who've contributed to Boyle McCauley News, you already know the answer. I'm going to come at it from my perspective as a Chinese-Canadian playwright and author. Now, I never did work for Boyle McCauley News, but I was involved with another publication early in my career. It was a publication called China City. And it was a quarterly that was founded by a Chinese-Canadian lawyer who believed that there were second and third generation Chinese who were interested in issues that affected the Chinese-Canadian community, but they couldn't read the Chinese language newspapers. And so China City was born, an English language newspaper that focused on issues relevant to Chinese Canadians. Now, I happened to become one of the contributors to that paper, and part of my contribution was a regular humor column about what it was like to grow up Chinese in Canada. And these pieces were sort of lighthearted, humorous pieces about my experiences growing up as a Chinese kid in a small town. Now, when I went to school, I didn't look like the other students in my class. And in the beginning, I often got teased for the way I looked. Some kids would make fun of the color of my skin. Other kids would make fun of my straight black hair. One really mean girl would run up to me almost every day and she'd pull her eyes down and she'd say, "Hey, look at me, I've got Chinese eyes just like you." Now, I felt horribly self-conscious about the way I looked, and I kind of wish the kids would stop bullying me. But I was young at the time and I had very strange ideas, and I thought maybe if I looked like the other kids, they'd stop teasing me. Now, I was pretty sure I couldn't change the color of my skin. I was fairly certain my mom wouldn't let me dye my hair blonde. But I thought I could do something about my eyes. I thought maybe if I pulled my eyes up, I would look like the other kids. I'd blend in and they'd stop teasing me. So I went home, I picked up a little dispenser of Scotch tape, and I tried to tape my eyes up. But back then, Scotch tape wasn't very strong, so I needed more and more strips of Scotch tape. And sometimes my eyelashes got stuck in the tape and it was really painful to rip out. And eventually I had my entire face wrapped up like a mummy. Now, my mom walks in and catches me. Now, I love my mom, but she is one of these brutally honest Chinese moms who will tell you exactly what she's thinking, doesn't care how to make you feel, she'll just tell you what's on her mind. My very honest mom walks in, sees me with all the Scotch tape around my face and goes, "Marty, what are you doing? You're wasting all the tape." I had to come clean. I tried to tell my mom that the kids at school were making fun of me because of my eyes, and I was trying to tape them up so I could look like everyone else. My brutally honest mom looks at my face and shakes her head and goes, "Oh, Marty, you don't have to worry about your eyes. You should be more worried about your nose." Turns out she thought my nose was too wide, and thanks to her, not only did I have Scotch tape wrapped around my face to pull my eyes up, but I also had a clothespin pinched over my nose to make it thinner. So that's an example of some of the humor pieces that I wrote for China City. Now, unfortunately, the publication folded after about a year and a half, and I'm hoping it's not because of the columns I wrote. But I do remember having conversations with my publisher about our shared experiences growing up as Chinese Canadians. And there was one thing that we hit upon that I thought I would relate to the people here today, the residents of Boyle and McCauley. And the best way I can sort of sum up this shared experience is in a question that I'm often asked when I meet people for the very first time. When I meet people for the first time, they always ask, "Where are you from?" or "Where were you born?" And I try to joke and say I was born in a hospital. And then ultimately I reveal that I was born in Edmonton. And it prompts the follow-up question, which is a bit of a loaded question. They go, "No, no, no, no. Where are you really from?" And to me, I always think of that as a loaded question because what they're doing is they're trying to find out my nationality because for some reason, they think if they know where I'm originally from, they'll know exactly who I am based on whatever misconceptions they have. So when people find out that I'm Chinese, they automatically think I'm an engineer, or I'm in the sciences, or I'm a doctor. They ask me how many car accidents I've caused. And I think about that, like people wondering where you're from in order to determine what kind of person you are. And I relate that to the people who live in Boyle and McCauley, because when you talk about where you're from or which neighborhood you live in, you might hear another loaded phrase, inner city neighborhood. And what goes with that is a certain set of misconceptions or misperceptions about the challenges you must face living in an inner city neighborhood, challenges that people don't face supposedly in a suburban neighborhood. And to me, those misconceptions, those stereotypes that people have, serve to distance us from each other. When people only have a certain impression of about a community or a place, they don't actually get the real story. And I'm going to share with you my impressions of these two communities. Boyle was actually my first home. When my parents came to Canada, they wound up in Edmonton and they rented an apartment in the Boyle area. I'm too young to remember the apartment, but when I asked my mom and dad, they said that the apartment building was somewhere around where the downtown police station is today. And every time I go past the police station, I have this weird sense memory of being a little kid and staring out the window of the apartment down at a park, and all I wanted to do was run down and play in that park. So when people talk about inner city or Boyle or McCauley, my thought is Boyle was the first neighborhood that welcomed my family to Canada. Now, you have to imagine this. My parents came in the 60s, and it was a little intimidating for them to be in Edmonton. They were two Chinese immigrants. My dad spoke some English. He read some English. My mom did not speak or read English. And they would have to figure out how to get through the city, try to figure out bus routes, try to figure out where the stores were for their essential services. And my dad, for those of you who are old enough to remember, he worked at the Beachcombers, you remember? Polynesian themed restaurant? Oh yeah, a few of you do, okay. My mom, she worked as a seamstress at the GWG garment factory. More people remember that. Now, my parents had friends and co-workers at work that could tell them what they needed to know in order to buy their groceries and get around the city. My dad also believed that the newspaper was a gateway to knowledge, and so he would get his hands on the Edmonton Journal newspaper and read that thing from front to back, trying to get information about what was going on in the world, what was going on in the city. Now, my parents were here before Boyle McCauley News was founded, but I'll bet you, if my parents were still in Boyle in 1979 when Boyle McCauley News was founded, I would be pretty sure that my dad would snap up an issue and be reading that from top to bottom to find out what was going on in his community. At its base level, community newspapers offer great information about what is going on in the community. It could be something as simple and mundane as a change in garbage collection schedules. It could be something along the lines of McCauley Rink offering free hockey and skating lessons. Or it could be a fundraising update. I remember seeing, was it in 2005, there was a Buy a Brick campaign to revitalize Giovanni Capoto Park. Whether it's calls to action, community events, new neighborhood beautification projects, community newspapers offer great information about what's going on in the community. Now, if Boyle McCauley News only provided that information, it would be a pretty valuable resource. But in today's digital era, that same information could show up on a Facebook wall. There could be a website devoted to this information. I think a community newspaper has to offer more than just what's going on. They have to tell us why everything matters in a community. And going through some of the back issues of Boyle McCauley News, I can see that the staff, the volunteers, have really embraced that notion of why. And they have shown in the pages of Boyle McCauley News the reasons why these two neighborhoods are great communities to live in. And what I've noticed is that you don't shy away from the challenges and the issues within the community. I mean, there was the issue about the Sons of Odin coming to Mustard Seed, inspiring some articles about intolerance and hate and how we are combating that, especially in a diverse neighborhood like McCauley and a diverse neighborhood like Boyle. There are the updates on the Safer McCauley initiative. And when you have those challenges, it lets us know what's going on in the community, but going along with that, you also have the accomplishments and the achievements within the neighborhood. I mean, it's great to see things highlighted, organizations like iHuman, that wonderful nonprofit organization that helps street youth express themselves creatively, whether it be through visual arts, fashion, music, or theater. There's also sort of the great perspectives from the residents who live in this community, whether it be McCauley Musings, Boyle Bits, Carrie's Corner, or Ability and Community. When you get these different voices coming through in the newspaper, you get a real sense of the diversity and the many facets of the community. And I think it's important to have those narratives because they help counter the stories that people may form. And usually the people who form these narratives are people who don't even live in Boyle or McCauley. And they come up with these stereotypes and these misconceptions of what the neighborhoods must be. And it's amazing how subtle a simple choice of words can affect our perception of a neighborhood or a person. I'm going to relate to you an example of what I mean by this. A few months ago, I happened to be watching the supper hour news. And there were two news items that came up that I wanted to compare and contrast. The news kicked off with breaking news about the actor Kevin Spacey, who had been charged with sexual assault. In the news item, they identified Kevin Spacey's victim as an 18-year-old boy. Now I'm going to underline that, 18-year-old boy, okay? Later in the broadcast, there was a more local news item in which the police had apprehended a serial arsonist, a hardened criminal that was setting fires throughout a neighborhood. And they identified this hardened criminal as a 17-year-old man. And I thought, that's strange. You've got two different ages. One is older, one is younger, but you identified the victim of sexual assault as a boy. And I started thinking, oh, somebody's trying to tell a story. For some reason, the reporter or the editors of that first news item had the mistaken belief that a victim of sexual assault can't be a man, that it has to be a boy. Now, I'm going to go on record by saying sexual assault is a horrible crime, and victims can be boys, they can be men, they can be women, they can be girls. You don't have to juice up the narrative by trying to change that man into a boy. And if those kinds of narratives get out there, they have the potential to seep into the public consciousness and go from simple misconceptions to becoming the accepted norm or the truth about people and communities. And I want to share with you a very quick story about how I came across one of these examples of leaving narratives unchallenged. And it has to do with the play that I wrote. It's called Mom, Dad, I'm Living with a White Girl. It was inspired by a personal experience when I was a teenager. My parents had a grocery store in a small town just north of here called Morinville. And my mom decided that there was no girl good enough to date her firstborn son. So she pulled me aside and gave me a very strange form of dating advice. She said, Marty, whatever you do, don't date white girls. We are the only Chinese family in this small town. So as you can imagine, I had no social life. But my mom's paranoia and prejudice stuck with me years later when I moved out of my parents' home, came to Edmonton, fell in love with a beautiful woman named Michelle, who's not Chinese, she's Dutch. We were so much in love that we decided to move in together. But I was so afraid of my parents finding out about my new living arrangement, I decided to keep it secret for about 3 weeks. Now, at the time, TELUS had just brought in call display, so we could screen any calls coming in from the Chan residence, and Michelle knew not to answer the phone when my mom was calling. And not only was Michelle beautiful, but she was also patient and generous, and she agreed to live out of boxes so that at a moment's notice we could stick all her things into boxes, shove the boxes into closets, wipe out all traces of her existence. Now, if you've lived anywhere for longer than a couple of days, you know your stuff starts to spread out, right? There's an extra toothbrush in the bathroom, a pair of women's shoes in the front hall closet, a bra that's hanging off the back of the doorknob. And I realized I had to come clean. But I was a coward, and there was no way I was going to do this in private. So I called my parents up and I invited them to a popular Chinese restaurant where I offered to pay for dinner. And my parents were like, oh, what a good Chinese son, he's showing us respect. Meanwhile, I'm just looking for a popular restaurant with lots of customers, plenty of witnesses, right? Now, if you've ever been in an authentic Chinese restaurant, an authentic Chinese meal is like 8 or 9 courses, the one plate that comes out after the other and everybody eats family style. Now, I am thinking, when is the best time to break the news to my mom and dad? And I know that their favorite dish is sweet and sour pork. And I go, you know what? I'll wait till the sweet and sour pork arrives. When my parents dig in, they'll feel good about their favorite dish. They'll feel so good that when I break the news, it won't even matter to them. So I'm sitting at the table waiting for the sweet and sour pork to arrive. And I'm waiting. And waiting. And I'm breaking into a small, cold sweat. Finally, the sweet and sour pork lands on the table. My parents dig in. I wait for them to take a couple of bites, and then I break the news. Mom, Dad, I'm living with a white girl. Apparently the pork was off that night because it didn't have the desired effect. The best way I can characterize my parents' reaction is there's a word in Chinese that you use when your life goes terribly wrong. That word is "aiya." And it's a very versatile word, because the louder you say it, the worse things are. So if I lose my place in my keynote, I just go, "Ayya." Or if you leave tonight, find out that your car's gone, your reaction would be a little bigger. It'd be more like, "Ayya." Or in the case of my mom, when she found out I was living with a white girl, her reaction was, "Ayya!" So here I am in the middle of this busy Chinese restaurant. My parents are yelling at me at the top of their lungs in Cantonese. Half the us customers can understand, the other half can't. So all the non-Chinese speaking customers are looking at us and going, wow, that's a loud family. And all the Chinese parents are going, yeah, give it to him, he's a bad Chinese son. While my parents were yelling at me, I thought, you know what? This might make a good idea for a play. And that became the inspiration for Mom, Dad, I'm Living with a White Girl. Now, not only was that play about my personal experience, but I tried in the play to skewer stereotypes about the Chinese, and I tried to address some of the discriminatory or racist beliefs that people have about the Chinese. The play premiered in Toronto in 1995. It was a huge success there. It went across Canada on a tour, and it wound up off Broadway in 2004. The thing that I found... Thank you. Anything for cheap applause. I got new pants today. One of the cities that Mom, Dad went to was Nanaimo. And I remember going to Nanaimo to help promote the play. And I was contacted by a Chinese man who wanted to meet for coffee. And I thought, oh, well, this is great. I get to plug into the community and promote the play. When we met for coffee, the Chinese man's opening gambit or opening salvo was, you should have never brought the play here. We've just put everything into the box here in Nanaimo, and I'm afraid your play is going to bring everything out of the box. Now, I knew what he was talking about when he was referring to the box. He was talking about the racial tensions in Nanaimo. A little bit of history, Nanaimo was one of the destination points for a lot of the Chinese immigrants who came to help build the railroad. When the railroad was completed, the government introduced some racist immigration policies to keep the Chinese from bringing more people into the country. There was a head tax charged only on Chinese immigrants. There was an exclusion act that stopped immigration coming in from China. A lot of the immigrants and the railroad workers were left without their families, and they would congregate in Chinatowns throughout Western Canada. Nanaimo was one of those destination points, and it sparked a lot of racial tension within that community. When he told me about the box, I said, look, I know my play is trying to address racism, but that's the only way that you're going to eradicate racism. If you put it in a box, it's just going to fester and become something else. You got to bring it up. And I'm trying to bring it up in a way that's lighthearted and satirical so that people who hold mistaken beliefs about the Chinese can laugh at themselves and realize how ridiculous it is to hold these discriminatory views. I said, at least come to the opening night. I'll give you 2 tickets. Come see the show before you judge it. I went back to rehearsals to tell my actors about my experience. And one of my actors said, yeah, things are kind of tense here. I'm staying at a billet. And my host, I gave her opening night tickets to the show, and my host said, oh wow, I'm excited to see the play about the Chinaman. Now, Chinaman is a derogatory slur against the Chinese, and my actor was taken aback that this woman had used the term right in front of her. And she said, this woman is university educated, she's a teacher, and I don't know if she's a racist or she doesn't know any better. Now, fast forward to opening night. The play is a success, people laugh at the right places, but what I'm most curious about is the reception afterwards. In the lobby, audiences are talking about the play, but then they start talking about the racism that exists within the community of Nanaimo. And the Chinese man who told me that I should never have brought the play to Nanaimo starts to talk about his experiences growing up in the community. He talks about how kids would throw stones at him, and they would call him all sorts of horrible names, including Chinaman. The next day, my actor reports to me that the host of the billet where she's staying comes up to her and apologizes. She's mortified that she used that slur in front of my actor. She said she never knew that it was an offensive term. It was just a word that her family used, her father, her grandparents. They thought it was a word just like Frenchman or Englishman. Now that she knew that it was a derogatory slur, she would never use it again, and she would never pass it down to her children. At that point, I thought, if that Chinese man had never told his story, that slur would have just been passed down from generation to generation within the community of Nanaimo, and no one would have known any better. And to me, I think that's why it's important to represent the different voices in a community, because it counters whatever narrative people may have about inner city neighborhoods. When you come up with your story, you have the power to shape the narrative of your community. And Boyle McCauley News does a fantastic job of representing the diversity of voices within this community. I think about some of the amazing things that I came across in some of the back issues. There was the wonderful profile on Alex Taylor School principal Steve Ramsanker, who brought community schooling into the neighborhood, a very progressive initiative that not only helped the students in his school, but also their parents as well, so that immigrant parents could learn English with their kids, and there was a daycare so that working parents knew that their kids would be safe after school. I also think about how when you put a face on the community, it actually makes the community come to life. Another story I came across that I thought was quite heartwarming was the celebration of life of Mary Burley, the community worker at Boyle Co-op. Just by reading that, you got a sense of this woman's love for the McCauley neighborhood, her sense of passion for social justice issues, and apparently she was also known for her big hugs. When you see that profile on somebody who works and lives in the community, you get a sense of what's really important in a community. It's not the buildings, it's not the streets, it's the people who work and live here. And you guys have to recognize how proud you must feel when you read Boyle McCauley News and see the profiles of some of the amazing people who work and live here. There's Kate Quinn, who's the tireless advocate for victims of sexual exploitation. There's Teresa Spinelli, who turned the Italian Center from a neighborhood grocery store into a growing chain of stores within the city and down in Calgary. When you see those stories, you realize that this community, these two communities, are more than just people's first impressions of inner city neighborhoods. And I think it's important to have those voices represented, because when somebody else tells your story, they take away your voice. And Boyle McCauley News is the voice that these communities need in order to make sure that your story gets out there. But of course, Boyle McCauley News needs your support, because there are many people, as you saw earlier with the awards, there are many volunteers to help put the paper together. And to finish out my talk, I thought I would leave you with one final image about the importance of supporting Boyle McCauley News. I'm just gonna move my mic over a little bit over here. Since we're talking about newspapers, I thought I would bring some newspaper clippings to illustrate what I'm talking about. Over here, these clippings represent the writers and photographers who contribute to the newspaper. Over here, these clippings represent the small but dedicated editorial staff, designers who put together the paper. Over here, this clipping represents the many carriers who make sure that the newspaper gets delivered to the people in the community. And over here, this clipping represents all the readers and supporters of the newspaper. You need all these people coming together to make that newspaper come together. Because when all those dedicated volunteers come together, you have a newspaper. Thank you, and good night. Enjoy the next 40 years.